really follow and cover politics in the United States, but Joe Biden and Donald Trump, people want to know over here in Russia and in Europe. So I want to ask you a few questions about it. You take it wherever you're going to go. Um, First of all, I'd like to get your comments on Joseph Biden. They call him Sleepy Joe. Um, my concern is not so much that he is losing his faculties, mental and physical, but they're covering up a multitude of crimes. Uh, well known here in Russia and Ukraine, the pay to play, bribes, publicly on YouTube. He said how Poroshenko, if you don't fire the justice that's investigating Burisma, you're not going to get your money. And I'm going to be on a plane and I'm going home. I mean, high crimes and treason. So I'd like to hear from you. What the heck is going on in the United States, and how is this being covered up? Trump isn't even talking about it much anymore. What are your thoughts?
Watching this stuff from the inside is dizzying. Okay. Especially if you're paying attention to, like, the law, for example. They had the spectacle this past weekend of dozens of members of the House of Representatives, after being lobbied, almost with baseball bats for months now, since the latest Speaker of the House took office as Speaker, to send, tens of millions of billions of dollars more to the Ukraine war and everyone connected to it. That as they voted to send $61 billion to Ukraine, waved little yellow and blue Ukrainian flags on the floor of the House as a part of the process that resulted in this gift, nominally to the Ukrainian government. Anyone that's familiar with the Foreign Agents Registration Act, even peripherally, knows that what they were doing was violation of 611H. Actually, it was a violation of FARA, but it applied because under 611H, they were acting as public relations agents. It just describes if you're using their logo and the slogans and all the marketing trappings, for some purpose, that what you're doing is lobbying for the Ukrainian government in this case. And what they were doing, they were lobbying for the Ukrainian government as agents of the Ukrainian government in the Congress. They're colleagues, and it resulted in a $61 billion gift. I don't know that anyone here is raising a question about that at the very same time that people are in the streets in Tbilisi because the government there wants to adopt a Foreign Agents Registration Act that would require all these American and European nonprofits that are operating to organize a counter-revolution in Georgia, the state, the country, Georgia, Tbilisi. They're operating inside the country. The government wants to require them to register as agents of the nations on which, whose interests they're acting on behalf of. That has, like people in the streets, trying to burn down buildings and stuff in Tbilisi. And here, the Congress that adopted the law itself flaunts it on the floor of the House as it doles out $61 billion. So you got that kind of ridiculousness going on just looking at the face of it. The logic of sending any money into that war from the point of view of the United States leads to, if you just follow the logic, leads to some very unsettling conclusion. The end result in each case of possible tracks this can follow, not good. Either And so what they did do was they bought time for the disposition of the Ukraine war to happen after the election, that Ukraine won't get trounced before November, adversely affecting Biden's, chances of being reelected. So they think they bought that time. Of course, $61 billion only buys as much time as the current, if you're going to make your estimates, as the current rate of consumption goes. If Russia decides to up the ante, they'll run out of $61 billion sooner. So there's that gamble. But whatever that is, at the end of the day, one of two possible outcomes here. One is that the U.S. is successful in inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, which is what it claims that it wants to do, which seems impossible if the form that's going to take is a military victory against Russia using Ukraine as the battering ram. In the event that they're going to push that point, they're going to have to introduce troops. They've started to do the advisors already. In fact, they added additional advisors, and they call them some further step closer to, being engaged. This latest batch. So either they're going to get directly involved, which means there's going to be a war between the U.S. and Russia directly, which means stuff here will probably start to blow up, and a lot of stuff in both places when it blows up. It won't be two guys with machine guns in a mall, but rather like blocks of buildings vaporizing and such. So that's one possible, one of the two possible outcomes. Either the U.S. gets involved and it leads directly to war, or the U.S. loses, or the U.S. is successful in forcing a strategic defeat on Russia. And Russia's nuclear policy is if we suffer a strategic defeat, in other words, if the integrity of the state, of our government, of our country is seriously threatened, we launch nuclear missiles as part of our defense. So this is what they're spending another $61 billion to get into. If they had not done this, during the election, Biden is in a position of saying, well, we spent $200 billion or whatever they admit they've dumped into that. And, it failed. We started a war with Russia and lost. Vote for me. It's a pretty difficult position to run for office in the United States from that position. But so is, look, election day is the day after tomorrow. If you start putting on lots of clothing and try to dig a hole from your shelter up to the surface to vote, maybe there's a ballot place somewhere near where you're holed up. I mean, in other words, the catastrophe war takes place. So that's one of Biden's projects right now. Another one is what's going on in Israel, or what's going on in Palestine, meaning Israel, and the slaughter of tens of thousands of people in Gaza, the leveling of the infrastructure there. It's clearly a demolition job anticipating a redevelopment, quote unquote, urban renewal en masse. And the economy here at home, I would use the economist's term of art, sucks. People here understand that the economy is no good because it's not serving them. People have to pay more for housing than they ever did. They're more food distressed than they ever have been in this country, including during the Great Depression at this point in the 1929, 1930s. Banks are teetering. The commercial real estate market has some issues that are like just in front of us. The residential real estate market is close to the end of a bubble, most likely. And so if any of these things pop and become manifest between now and November, what is a catastrophe now for some millions of people will become a catastrophe for perhaps 10 to 100 million people. There are millions of people in either foreclosure or um, eviction in the United States already. There are, and that number will grow. There have been hundreds of thousands to low millions in that position since 2008, since the last bank crash. If there is a real estate market collapse, there will be some very heavy casualties in the financial sector, banks, real estate investment trusts in particular. That is the stuff that affects rich people, and then suddenly the newspapers start talking about it. But the things like 2/3 of the people in the country don't have $1,000 that's liquid, like that they could spend in an emergency, or don't have it at all, even in terms of assets. That's an immense thing in what's supposed to be the richest country in the world. One of the ways that the U.S. was able to construct and maintain an empire was at the basis. They spread enough of the booty around here to privilege the people to buy acquiescence or quiescence in any event. Even the oppressed classes here, particularly African Americans, for example, as horrible as the conditions were for them in a million different ways, including relatively economically, the U.S. stole so much wealth from around the world that even some of that was able to fall into their hands before say the mid '60s and at least a legal change in environment. That condition is evaporating now. That privilege has evaporated or is in the process of evaporating for the majority of people in the country. People that were middle class, white, suburbanites are finding themselves in very similar material condition to the people that they had privilege over before, on in that matter in particular, and their prospects tell them it's going to get worse. The institutions don't respond at all. You have, for example, a 8 to 20% favorable rating for Congress, depending on the year, but this has been steady between those two for the last decades. And you have a 98% reelection rate of the same people who are not favored by the people. Every measure materially shows a decline in the condition of the people in this country, and the avenues of redress have been shrinking steadily and sometimes by leaps and bounds. Censorship of political speech and other social contrary notions. There's clamped down on that across the board. Even as social media have expanded the possibility of connection, of finding new people all around the world on the other end of a conversation or in a room having a conversation. The very fact that the conversations are mediated empowers those with control over the mediation devices, like platforms like Facebook and etc. And once that was acknowledged and recognized and developed to the point that it is, a partnership grew between the government here and the operators of these systems, Google and Facebook, Meta, whatever, etc. And so what was the possibility of a tidal wave of free speech has instead become like a grid with controls around every corner. So we're in really bad shape, and everything is being done to not allow us a device by which to remedy that situation. So there's a palpable sense of frustration and anger in the country, and that is the climate in which Joe Biden would be reelected. There is a question, a serious question about his competence, of course, that is pervasive in the public discussion here, and the complete disallowance of a real mature discussion of that, but in the media anywhere. And then there is the leading opponent in terms of polling data, Donald Trump, being subjected to ridiculous numbers of criminal cases being brought against him for things that happened at least 6 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, some 20 and 30 years ago, in the dozens in terms of the number of charges, approaching 100, I think, 90 something or 80 something. And the entire wall-to-wall media is saying that this is being done because he's such an evil criminal personality and distinguished from all of the other players because you can see he's being treated differently. It's because he is different. He's a real criminal on the one hand, and a complete failure of any room for a discussion that perhaps this is a political hit, lawfare, etc. That is the sort of the framing of the condition for this year's election. Biden himself, that discussion about his mental competence has nothing to do with it, only icing on the cake, I guess, or cherry on the icing. For my reasons that Joe Biden should be nowhere near any position of authority, power, or even honor. His career as a senator from 1973 forward shows him to be a lackey, a toady of essentially financial services industry. He was the senator, one of the two senators, but the senator from Delaware, which is America's onshore, offshore tax and corporate secrecy haven, constructing federal laws for the benefit of the financial services industry, banks, investment banks, and credit card operators. The bankruptcy law, you had an exemption, the removal of the exemption of under bankruptcy law of things like student debt are the reason that there is such massive student debt. He introduced and shepherded those bills through Congress. He's responsible for that. This was something credit card companies and student debt lenders wanted to see done. They did not want people filing bankruptcy and discharging their credit card or student loans in bankruptcy. And so the laws were adjusted to suit that, and he was one of the primary agents of that. So when he comes into office claiming he's going to forgive student debt and doesn't, it's a surprise to some people, but not to anyone that's been paying attention to his career. He was one of the architects and certainly one of the primary salespeople, public relations wise, of the three strikes you're out laws and drug laws of the 1990s that are the architecture of mass incarceration, which Democrats blame Republicans for. Joe Biden was one of the deep set of hands on that. And you can go to C-SPAN and find a clip of him in the mid-90s during Bill Clinton's time talking about predators and animals and such in reference to black adolescents and post-adolescents. He's a despicable, I was going to say human being, but I don't know if I grant that. He's a despicable being who was responsible for the destruction of several countries, including Ukraine and Libya, and the murder and deaths of tens of thousands of people in those places and in other places. And he is standing for president, free and clear of any charges, against Trump, who's under all these other charges, who has a little blood on his hands too, but I would say 4 years as opposed to 51 now of Biden's time in office since he took office in 73. And in terms of the actual number of deaths, he blew up a blockbuster bomb somewhere. I think it might have killed one or two people. He murdered Soleimani, the general from Iran. Some other bad behavior, but nothing on the scale of what Joe Biden has done. So we got two killers. One is a real mass killer. The other's a thug killer. That's our choice for president. And our entire treasury, the bulk of what's left of our economy, are dedicated to fighting a war with Russia so that in the mind of the people here, they can get their hands on its mineral wealth and they can remove it as a strategic umbrella for the rising multipolar world.
Wow. That's pretty sobering. I have a couple of questions. First of all, what would you say is the mood or feeling of people in the United States to have to choose against a really bad evil and another really bad evil?
Yeah.
Is there disinterest in this upcoming election? How are people looking at that? It's not too far off.
First of all, the feeling for it is different than I've ever experienced. Partly, the last presidential election in 2020 was a unique one in my lifetime. Because of COVID, that was the official reason. They, in essence, canceled the Democratic convention. They held it in somebody's basement, produced by some public access TV producer from Minnesota or something. I don't know where. In essence, they put on a 3-day TV show that was badly produced and with not very good technical specs also. And instead of the usual, big ceremonial feel and gathering of the troops of each of the two parties in a convention, with 15,000 of them perhaps, packed into the convention center. Robust debates during the primary season, which we didn't really see this year either. And also a something resembling a policy debate in the media, which we're not seeing at all. There is no alternative discussed in the media here to the ongoing permanent wars and the other policies that are being implemented, both with national and international scope. They discussed the policy that is, being implemented. That's under, it's under work, and what's happened today in that particular area. So you'll see a story about the funding for Ukraine, and you'll see what Zelensky said yesterday to the president of Poland or something. You won't hear, you won't see in the main media, for example, the actual speech from Marjorie Taylor Greene when she says on the floor of the House over the weekend that the problem facing all of us with our economy collapsing and such is the business model that the U.S. government uses for its budget and for its operation, which is to conduct wars that murder people around the world and use up indecent, I forget what word she used, amounts of money that should be going to housing, food, clothing, education, healthcare, etc., so that the money can instead be sent to arms manufacturers and others who are parasites on this operation, and that, in essence, trades money for blood. That is not on television anywhere unless you look at a forget how many 8-hour, 6-hour congressional hearing. It's like a 1-minute, 2-minute slice in the middle of it. And there aren't that many voices expressing this. She herself said that the one thing you never hear demand for in the Congress is peace, because peace is an affront and an impediment to that business model. And then she described the one I just described. There was a vote in the Congress on this funding for more money for Ukraine, for Israel, and to start some trouble in Taiwan with China. Out of the 400, excuse me, out of the 435 members of Congress, of the House of Representatives that voted, 112 voted no. For instance, a $95 billion bill that goes to all three of those projects. Of the 112 that voted no, they were all Republicans. These 200 and something votes in favor. I forget what it was. Of Democrats all voted yes. Every Democrat in the House voted yes, with the exception of 3 who didn't vote. They NV. 101 Republicans voted yes, and 112 voted no, and something like 2 and 1. 1 was not present, and 2 didn't vote. That's the layout of the Congress. The polling data tells you that 70% of the American people don't want to be in the war in Ukraine, and don't want to spend any more money on it. So that vector is, and here we're heavy propaganda for Ukraine and war over the last years. So, and yet it's 70% opposed. But the vector between the vote in Congress and political public sentiment kind of shows you what you're hearing out in the public space. The party line, Democrats are in favor of Joe Biden because he is not Trump. And they will tell you not to say anything negative about Joe Biden because what you're doing is helping to elect Donald Trump. This is the same argument that Hillary Clinton used in 2016 with such success. And also the Republican establishment is looking, along the same lines. They don't want to see Trump elected, and so anything else is worth a look at. About half, I think, if I'm going to just ballpark it from anecdotal experience, about half of the people around me now and people that I see, that are seriously talking about this, fall into that category of that red-blue paradigm, and maybe a little less than half. And I would say a little more than half now are looking at this independent of that aspect of electoral politics. Some, like 10%, according to some polls, and maybe up to 30%, according to others, are still looking to the electoral cycle for relief and see a possibility of that in RFK Jr. And there are others that see no possibility for redress in the political system and are, awaiting the next development. I'd have to say I'm probably in that category. But the discussion almost nowhere. The people who support Trump are hopeful. They think he's going to be reelected, and they think he'll do good and better than last time in their eyes. The people who support Biden are nervous. You can tell that. It's because things are not going well out in the world, and his condition is, visibly deteriorating. So they don't know what's going to come out next. If it's going to be, they don't know whose banner to hang out in the front lawn. Gavin Newsom, Michelle Obama, some other. I was going to say lesser, but it's kind of hard to find one. They don't know what's going to happen, but they support Joe Biden 100% right now. And the about half or better, the ones that have characterized as independents, some see Kennedy as a solution. Most don't, or I would say many don't. And I don't see, consequently, with all of that, any great change in our condition, politically or materially, economically, etc., as an outcome of the election.
All right. I have to ask you the $64,000 question. Given the animosity, the anger that you talked about earlier, that is palpable in the United States, depending on the outcome of this election, do you think there's a possibility of violence?
I would say likelihood. If Trump wins, Democrats are going to say the election was stolen, like they did in 2017. And I think the thresholds have been crossed in a way, at least in terms of PR and perception, that this time Trump stealing the election in the eyes of Democrats is even more dangerous. This is now, March or April of 1932, and Trump and his legions have shown their disregard for constitutional government back in 2021 on January 6th. And so we now have to resort to violence to protect our country. I see that possibility. And I see, on the other hand, people who had protested in 2021 not getting relief, some of them saying, we're not letting this go down again. So it's possible. I would say likely.
Yeah. You said something about Trump not really wanting to honor the Constitution. I would say I don't think Joe Biden has honored the Constitution. I think under him, they've demolished it, especially the First Amendment. Now, that's where I want to go with this.
I want to be clear first. I didn't say that I perceive it that way. I said that Biden's supporters view Trump in that light.
Yeah.
That Trump is the great evil. And now that we're talking about the Constitution, he hates that too. If we were talking about puppies, he hates them too. So he hates Jesus, because even though the religious right, quote unquote, whatever, tends to support him, they really all hate Jesus because Trump hates everything good. That's the mindset among this group of people. It's not my mindset. I don't see things in those terms at all. It doesn't mean I support him or oppose him or whatever. I don't think in the terms that the electorate does in general.
Yeah, no, I think you articulated it very objectively. I didn't ask you for a partisan statement, so I really appreciate that. But I want to talk about freedom and democracy now in the United States. There's two things that are happening right now. I think the first, most people are not even aware, but Congress approved the continuation of the FISA, and that allows the United States government to spy on United States citizens. I can't believe there's not an uproar happening over this. I remember when Obama was criticized for spying on Dilma Rousseff and on Angela Merkel. And then Snowden let the whole world know that they're spying on everybody, all of us. And the second thing that I would like you to comment on is the put down of the pro-Palestinian protests and camps that are starting to rise up on a number of university campuses. I just read today that I don't know if it was the National Guard, but somebody took down the camp at the University of Minnesota. But today, the students are rebuilding it. What can you say about the freedom and democracy in the United States being all but dead?
Well, first of all, 54 years ago, I guess it'll be next week, May 4th, 1970, the Kent State shootings on the campus of Kent State University in Ohio took place. The 54th anniversary is this coming May 4th. And the temperature on the college campuses around this massacre, certainly, if you want to argue over terminology, that one applies, obviously, and it's difficult. It's impossible to argue. This massacre is not being tolerated by young people in the United States, and they are organized already to resist it, and that's becoming manifest on college campuses. I first heard about it in relation to Columbia University here in New York City, but it has spread pretty rapidly. I recall how quickly the Occupy movement spread once the embers had landed in various places, and I think the soil is probably even riper now for this kind of activity. So I think we're going to see an intensification over the next week or two of this in a way that is going to check and mate this attempted, the police actions that they have been doing at Columbia, what they did at the incident you're discussing, other responses by the state, the kind of response that Obama made to Occupy. I think that stuff is now known to people who organize these things. In fact, some said that they had studied some lessons at Columbia from 1968. And I think the challenge is going to come to the attempt by the state to put us to sleep on a scale that one would say represents escalation. Now, back in 2011, which is now 13 years ago, 12 and a half years ago, was in September of 2011. You started to see this Occupy, it became a movement, I guess, develop and spread like wildfire. And while I was looking at it, and while people were organizing into people's assemblies, basically, to talk through policy issues and try to make decisions collectively, sort of an embryonic, what you might call a workers' council in Soviet time, a Russian Revolution. In other words, Soviet in Russian. The embryonic, people's assemblies starting to go through the motions. I asked a few media outlets when I was being interviewed about it what I thought, and I said, this looks to me, maybe we're looking at 1905, and we're going to be waiting for 1917. And so I'm thinking of that now. Maybe we're looking at the beginnings of 1917.
Wow. A revolution.
It's possible.
Yeah. I don't see any other. There's no fixing the system. There's nothing that'll fix it. It's got to either implode, or it's got to be a revolution. And it was really interesting. It's very.
If I might, the problem is with revolution that today, in this day and age, with this elite and with the tools that are in their hands across the board, the largest data set in the history of the world, the largest amount of processing power to apply to whatever problems they want to study and solve, then by orders of magnitude, because of the supercomputing capabilities as opposed to raw human intelligence and the development of technology over the last 100 years, et cetera. You're going to see, if you have a revolutionary battle under present conditions, a bloodbath that may consume our species. It could turn into World War III, and it could turn into a nuclear war. God knows what else they're capable of, by the way, because they have possession of these nuclear weapons and obviously the at least threat to use them. So they're capable of lots of other things. We have to find a way, I think, to effect a complete change in the power relations, where the power is removed from this elite and placed in the hands of the people in one way or another, and not symbolically, and not through some, quote unquote representational scheme, but the actual power placed in the actual hands of the people. And I don't know how you get from here to there unless you're talking about, in essence, people just dropping their hands on the existing machinery and starting to operate the aspects of their lives that they've been operating on behalf of someone else for themselves. I don't know what form that takes. If we start, growing our own food in our backyards and trading it, looking at our whole block and our communities as economic, entities, and how they fit into a patchwork of these, and using maybe computers and data from the government that exists already to figure out how to organize it, and then how do you organize people, knowing especially that our communications now, although they're broad and deep, using the social media platforms, they're also all mediated. And we don't have the levers of mediation. They do. And so we may have trouble even just talking to anyone that we can't see if they don't want us to do that. And so under those conditions, though, if we can start our new society just with our own sweat and drop the operation of theirs, that might be a way that this can be done without provoking or involving, shooting of guns and bombs and all of that.
All right. I have to ask you, you mentioned them, these global elite who basically control everything. The deck is stacked against us. There is a movement, and I know you're aware of it, that seems to be going contrary to this, and that's the BRICS movement, spearheaded by one Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation and President Xi in China. Do you see it the way I do, that this is a direct confrontation between BRICS, the Global South, and BRICS Plus, because they're going to grow incrementally this year? Do you see this as the really important struggle for power in the future order of the world? How do you see that?
I think it's a very important sphere. It's a very important battlefield. And there are contradictions there too. Argentina, for example, was invited to join, had applied and invited to join. There was an election that replaced the government that negotiated that with the government that now sits in the presidential palace in Buenos Aires, Milei. And they announced when he was elected back in December that they're not going to go through with it. Instead, Argentina is now a partner with the United States. Just today, for example, they asked Interpol to arrest Iran's foreign minister, I think, he's in Pakistan and somewhere else today, 2 different countries, Sudan, and asked Interpol and the governments of those 2 countries to arrest him because of his alleged involvement in some bombing that took place back in, I think, 2004 or something in Buenos Aires. It comes out of a criminal case that Iran didn't appear in because they said they had nothing to do with it, period, and they weren't going to go to court because the government in Buenos Aires ordered them to. Like the position they took, I don't know if people are aware of this, but here in the United States, after the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center, a group calling itself the Survivors of the World Trade Center, bombing, whatever the hell they called it, brought a lawsuit against everybody except Saudi Arabia that had anything to do with the 18 people who were supposedly involved in blowing up the World Trade Center, etc. And they claimed because 2 of the 18 had sort of transshipped on a plane through Iran, that Iran somehow was culpable for what these 18 Saudis did. And so they named Iran in this lawsuit, and Iran said, we have nothing to do with this, and they didn't appear. And so a multi-billion-dollar default judgment was obtained against them. Iran had no intention of paying it. They have no assets or resources here that could be attached because of the U.S. sanctions. I mean, there's a whole history of these kinds of cases that end up creating the preconditions for the rising BRICS and other constructs that are alternatives, because it's as if you were in a gang in high school with 10 other guys, and you're the cool guys in school, supposedly. And then one by one, you start finding members of this group not so cool and kicking them out. At some point in time, there's one person standing there who is now the cool club, and these other 10 people organize their own. It's like that. They've painted themselves. They're painting themselves into a corner, and they continue to do it. If you look at the sanctions bill, for example, the various sanctions that exist against Venezuela, and they just added some more, restored some. You see, but there are exemptions that have to do with, for example, Citgo or Chevron. Why? Because when they sanctioned Russia, it took a big chunk of oil out of the market, and all of a sudden oil prices went up. People started having trouble paying for gasoline and heating oil here in the United States, and it created political problems. So they went, as they recognized this character, Juan Guaido, as the true president of Venezuela. Unfortunately, Juan can't give you a check drawn on Venezuela's bank. They went down to see Nicolas Maduro, who they had tried to kill, and said, please, can we do something? So they've carved out little, exemptions. Well, you're horrible and evil and all of that, so we can't do business with you, but you got any spare oil? They created a world like this around, what was before sort of the monopole, the hegemon. There are friction points across the board, and there are alternatives rising both at the regional level. Today's the ALBA conference, for example, with the Bolivarian construct in Latin America, and you've got all the things that have sprung up in Asia, the Belt and Road, and String of Pearls, and all of that, the SCO, and Mercosur, and a host of others. These are the rising alternatives to the pre-existing colonial order, and it doesn't really have a colonial form this time either, which is an interesting characteristic that isn't generally mentioned.
Yeah, and that's really well stated. I want to pursue this a little bit further, Don. These globalists, and they're all extremely, extremely wealthy people who control basically everything in the West. They're afraid of losing their power. But Russia and China, India, and several other countries are already trading in their own currencies or doing commodity exchanges, thereby bypassing the dollar. This is really clear to a lot of people that I speak with and that I know of, and certainly in this part of the world where I am. They're very aware of that because of the sanctions, because of American aggression, not only on Russia, China, but using their soft power all over the world. I see this, and I'm wondering how you see it. This challenge to the dollar has got to be their biggest fear.
Well,
would you agree with that? And Don, you mentioned how bad things were economically in the United States. They're as bad or worse all across Europe. People are feeling it. So how do you see this playing out in the United States? Do people even have a clue of what's going on this geopolitical level?
I think that when the what they call de-dollarization really takes hold, it's going to result in a tremendous change or shift in the standard of living and expectations in the United States. It's going to be a shock to, I think, most people here. I think it'll sweep like a tsunami, as a matter of fact. Having control over printing the currency is an incredibly powerful tool, weapon, asset, resource, whatever. The control of the global currency markets that the U.S. And Britain had in the period up to 1991, for example, from the beginning of the Russian Revolution, tremendous weapon that was used against the Soviet bloc that had a very heavy hand in it coming down in the 1990s, in 1980s and early 90s. The West leveraged the fact that they did not accept Russian currency in international trades. Russia had to acquire, the coin of the realm, so to speak, to do any trading, forgetting the sanctions that existed and all of that. It led to a retail network inside the Soviet Union based on Western currencies, which people did not have. They'd have to, in essence, they ended up stealing from their own economy to sell things cheaply at hotels and other places where Westerners were or Japanese people were, so they could get their hands on that currency, then go to what they call Berezovka stores and buy things that were not available elsewhere in the Soviet Union, Sony Walkman, stuff like that. This tool, this weapon, has been tested a number of times in the period since 1991. Two that come to mind are the case of Cote d'Ivoire and Libya. In 2009, 2010, the then president of Libya, who became the of Cote d'Ivoire, who became the ex-president of Cote d'Ivoire for trying to do this at gunpoint from the French army, decided that rather than continuing with their economy at the mercy of the printing presses in Paris, because Paris, as the former colonial power, never relinquished control over the currency of Cote d'Ivoire. And so Cote d'Ivoire could only they used the French franc even after France stopped using it as a national currency. When France went into the Eurozone, France continued to print francs for its former and current colonies. You can say across the board, current colonies in Africa, which meant that you only had so much money available to the government of Cote d'Ivoire based on what Paris allowed, as opposed to what policies the government wanted to adopt. And so Gbagbo decided that he was going to go off the French currency and print their own currency backed with resources that are plentiful in Cote d'Ivoire. He was removed from office at gunpoint by the French, as I mentioned. That was in December of 2010 that he was removed. In February of 2011, the U.S. began a war against Libya. Libya, in the previous 2 or 3 years, had started to take steps to convert its massive gold reserves into a trust that would back a Libyan currency for Africa, an African currency, the gold dinar. That would be a gold-backed currency that would be expanded to be backed by other natural resources of Africa and printed in accordance with the wishes of the governments of Africa, the participating governments. That was starting to come to fruition in terms of meetings and agreements when the United States decided to blow up Libya and murder Muammar Gaddafi. All of that happened in 2011. So people have understood the need to gain sovereign control of their currency. It has been a major point of contention, of control by the hegemon, monopole, whatever, to not allow this to happen. And at this point in time, the economic conditions have ripened, and so have the political conditions in a number of places around the world where this alternate currency is going to come into being all by itself. So along this entire package of things we're talking about, that you rightly pointed to as evidence that what I was suggesting needed to happen. In other words, we start running the world the way we want, and later for what they're doing, that this is actually happening, in a number of very important areas of the human political construct and political economy. And I think that that's a very positive development. We saw, just as an aside, UNISUR attempting to do the same with the UNO. That didn't get off the ground quite the way people wanted because of the massive contradictions that existed in UNISUR, but that's getting set right also, and we'll see what happens over the next period. But I think that's the trend generally. We got to figure out here in the United States how we can get involved in that. And because I think if we can fix the United States, then I think the threat to the world disappears or is severely diminished.
Yeah. The threat to the world. The hegemon, the globalist, these financial entities are desperately trying to hang on to their power. And you mentioned that it's a dangerous place that we're living in right now, but this BRICS movement and the move away from the dollar and all of the leverage that the United States has had with it, in my opinion, creates the existential real threat of the use of nuclear weapons. If they can't win, will they take the whole world down with them in a nuclear Armageddon?
Right.
I think that, to me, geopolitically is the big picture. But when we come back down to the micro level, the ground level, we see this conflict in Ukraine could get out of control very, very quickly. We see what's happening in the Middle East that could get out of control. In fact, we came very close to it, to being out of control. And then we can go over to the east and the East China Sea, and money that the United States just approved for Taiwan is creating enormous pressure and tension there. And I have to point out that Russia and China, North Korea, are nuclear armed states, as is Israel in the Middle East. I mean, if people were afraid in the fall of 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, thank God we had somebody who was an adult in a room in Kennedy and Khrushchev who listened to him, and they saved the world from being vaporized. Today, there doesn't appear to be anybody in the West, in the United States, that could be the adult in the room to end this. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, we don't even know who has their finger on the button here. Is it Biden's taxidermist? Is it Biden? I highly doubt that. And I'm not so sure, watching things develop. Yeah, Pakistan, that's right, too. Watching things develop, I'm not so sure, and India, by the way, too, right? I'm not so sure that the president actually is the one that has their hand on the button, so to speak. In other words, that decision is made by the president. To hear Robert McNamara describe what happened in 1962, it sounds like the president then was, in charge of these decisions, that he was drawing on what they called XCOM, this group of people to, kick it around with. And one of the things that McNamara talks about that he both mouthed himself in Fog of War, and is also referenced in 13 Days, RFK Sr.'s description of what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, as they call it, that they were afraid of someone pulling the temple down on their head, meaning the same thing you said before, that I'm going to blow up the world because I'm not going to win this battle that I'm involved in. That if I can't have it, nobody can. We don't know who those people are that make these decisions, so we have no way of gauging whether that is a possible choice for someone who has the power to implement it. In the old days, I come to this from time to time because it really illustrates a change in our condition. In the old days, we knew who the king was and where he lived. And so when things got too oppressive or mismanaged, or there was an urgent need for regime change, we knew where the castle was. Excuse me. We went there, we dragged his ass out, and did whatever we do, dispatched him, and new order started. Reset button, whatever. We have no idea who's in charge of making the macro decisions in terms of the global economy. We know all the structures, and we can see some of the machinery operate, like the Security Council, the World Bank, the ICJ, all these different things. But whoever it is that's actually making decisions on behalf of themselves and their class, that are members of the class and the key leadership members, we have no idea who that is. People talk about Soros, or there's a half a dozen of Warren Buffett, whomever, the Koch brothers, whatever. Well, we don't really know who it is. If we did, I think it's highly unlikely that if we found the major decision makers and dragged their ass out into the street and dispatched them, so to speak, that someone else isn't already at the lever by the time we pick our head up. This regime was made to survive a nuclear war. The infrastructure, the internet that we have, was made to survive a nuclear war. So that if you took out the government and you took out the military and you took out the industrial leaders, there was still a hierarchy with somebody at the top by design. So we have no idea what that is. And that's what made me laugh about January 6th was an attempt to overthrow the U.S. government, January 6th, 2021. Those people occupied Congress. Okay, I sit down at Nancy Pelosi's desk. I call the Pentagon. I want you to do a drone strike on Israel. Guy on the phone at the Pentagon, I think this is for you, and laughing. They can't order anyone to do anything. Going to call Treasury or call the Fed, print more money, borrow more money, lower interest rates. Securing, stealing, occupying forever. The Capitol building changes nothing. Changes a piece of real estate. Doesn't even change title to that. So, it's having a revolution in the conventional sense of it is difficult when you don't really know where the actual power is that you're revolting against. If we were to overthrow the U.S. government, so to speak, that would be, let's say, to force the president, vice president, cabinet, Congress to resign and leave Washington, D.C. Where are the levers of power? Where are the reins of power? I and the people, we all go down to D.C. now. Then what? It's a difficult thing to wrap your mind around when you think about it in actual material terms, but it's amorphous, this thing, and it's going to be a very difficult struggle. I'm not saying because we're going to get bloodied and because of this and that, but rather it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to actually identify the centers of power that have to be overthrown or negated in order for a revolution to be fulfilled. And so and of course it's going to be a bloodbath no matter what. These people are not going to let go without, taking a lot of people with them, if not everyone. And so we have to figure out how to manage that too. And again, I think we do that just by beginning to live the way we want and finding a way to support that materially. How do we eat and stay indoors? Does the sheriff come to evict us? Some of the promising things around, to me, the most promising things around Occupy back in 2011 Uh, in Albany and Philadelphia, I think it was, there were a couple of places where the orders came down from, on high, the governor or whatever, to evict the protesters from this or that occupation site. And in one case, a police chief said that's illegal, we're not doing it. In another case, another police official or a district attorney also refused and said, our sympathies are with the protesters. Things have gotten only worse since then. Things have only gotten worse since the 2016 election and the 2020 election. No matter how pleasant a picture they paint in the media, people know that their lives are difficult, that the economy, again, I'll use the word sucks, and that they have very few avenues available to them to fix it. And so there's going to be frustration and anger energizing whatever happens, and that'll be easily manipulated, because if someone shows up in front of the people that are motivated in this way and says, let's go get him, and points to somebody, a lot of folks are going to get in line and go get them, no matter who they are and no matter how proximate or remote they are to the actual centers of power. That's our main challenge, is going to be to follow that.
Don, if you were a professor and you were teaching political science, geopolitics 101, 2.0, 3.0, I would be enrolling in all of your classes.
You haven't seen the solution yet.
I have learned so much from you, your incredible knowledge, your experience, and your ability to articulate like not too many other people I know. Thank you so much for coming on the show tonight.
Thank you, too. I appreciate it, Regis. I appreciate talking with you also. I appreciate your insights. You have some really very good insights into the way things are, and make it easy for me to formulate my own thoughts, because I'm doing it in response to something that is kind of at the heart of what we're talking about. I appreciate it.